in 2014, I was asked to negotiate a resolution that Rwanda, who were on the Security Council at that time, proposed to bring to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the genocide in their country. So a very sensitive topic. And of course, the UK was very supportive of this idea. But I did have instructions from London to say that the language characterising how the genocide was described had to be very precisely written in terms of who had been killed in the genocide. So not just Tutsis, but also some Hutus and those people that opposed the genocide. It was a formulation that we needed to have in, and that we would have had a trouble supporting the resolution if this language wasn't correct. So I talked to my French and US counterparts. I realised quite quickly that my French counterparts was not going to say anything because it was just too sensitive for the French, and I understood that. But the US were on the same page as us. So I spoke to the Rwandan lead on the resolution before the negotiations and explained that we were supportive, but that we needed this precise language. And I said to him, I wanted to have this conversation privately ahead of time so that you knew it was coming and if there was any problem that we could try and sort it out, not in front of everyone else. But it was fine. They understood, so I mentioned it in the negotiations and got support from the US, and the language then was acceptable for London, and we were able to support the resolution. So my lesson out of this particular story is you need to have a plan, and you need to kind of game the situation before you go in, and you need to use your relationships to work out the best way of achieving what you want to achieve. And in this situation, I thought it was best handled through having kind of pre-conversations privately before taking it to the full meeting.
Hi, and welcome back to How to Diplomat. So, one of the biggest myths about diplomacy, and there's many, but the biggest one is that influence happens inside the room, that it's about what you say, how persuasive you are, or who wins the argument in the moment. My guest today, Simon, is a former UK diplomat who spent a significant part of his career negotiating inside the UN Security Council. And what he describes is the exact opposite of that myth. A successful outcome in the chamber is rarely about oratorical brilliance in public. That's really hard to say, oratorical. Anyway, it's about preparation, relationships, and the quiet conversations that happen around the theatre of the debate chamber itself. Particularly when the issue is sensitive and the stakes are high, the real work happens before you ever actually walk into the meeting room itself. We also properly geek out on all things UN, how Security Council resolutions are actually written, what silence procedure and going into blue really mean, and as a bonus, what to do if another country's foreign minister accidentally walks off with your coat in the dead of winter, just in case you ever find yourself in that situation. Anyway, let's dive in. Hi, Simon. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Hi, Jen. Thanks very much for inviting me. Great to be here.
So we are going to dive straight in, and we're going to start with you landing in New York, newly married, with no job, and then within, 48 hours, you ended up with a role in the heart of the Security Council, the UN Security Council. Take us through what happened there.
So that's right. We moved to New York because my wife got a job with the UN Secretariat, and I quit my job as a corporate lawyer with Baker & McKenzie in London and got on that plane without a job. But we had spotted this role being advertised at the UK mission to the UN to be the lead for West Africa in the Security Council team, and my wife said, "You should go for that." And I said, "You're kidding.
I don't know anything about."
They're not going to give me that. I don't know anything about West Africa or the UN, or never worked for government before, or the foreign policy, no training in diplomacy. But she persuaded me to go for it. And I found myself in an interview on our first business day there and found myself having got the job at the end of that day. So it was a fairy tale.
And what was going through your mind over the course of the day in the interview?
Well, I mean, I was very excited, daunted as well, because it was such an amazing opportunity to represent my country at the UN, but not only the UN, to represent my country at the UN Security Council, the supreme body that makes decisions on international peace and security. So I was super excited. I was disbelieving as well. It really was pinch yourself moment to have walked into a role like that. It was way beyond any expectations. As I was just saying, I never thought I would get that role, but I did, and it changed my life. And then the final emotion was to feel very fortunate. I think for that role to come up just as I arrived in New York was amazingly good timing. And so I felt very lucky to have the opportunity, and therefore I was absolutely determined to make the most of it.
So how quickly did your training wheels come off? How quickly were you straight into negotiating stuff in relation to West Africa?
Straight away. I remember in the first week, in fact, the first one I went to, actually, I was shadowing a colleague. I did.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay.
Yeah, I did. I got to sit behind him and watch him do the negotiation. But no, it was week one, straight into a Security Council product. I think it was on Gulf of Guinea piracy or something, because Togo had the presidency of the council that month. So yeah, straight in.
And what can you remember what your kind of key takeaways were in that first week watching your colleague negotiate in relation to skills that you could immediately adopt?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways I learned was just to obviously observe my colleague, but observe what everybody else around the room was doing, ask lots of questions, and then just get talking to people. I mean, that's the best way to learn, is just to talk to people, try and learn about the issues and about how things work from them.
So you mentioned one of the moments that you were most proud of was throughout the Mali crisis at that point. Could you just explain what the Mali crisis was, and then I'll ask my question?
So I started this role in February 2012, and then a few weeks after I started the role, a major crisis started evolving in Mali, whereby armed groups in the north took control of the north of the country. They fought and won against the government troops, and they were then moving south to threaten the capitals. A military intervention was needed, which had to be authorized by the Security Council. It was a French military intervention, but actually one of the elements that made it this particularly important for us, the UK, was that the UK actually flew many of the French troops in, and so. So there was an international response needed through the Security Council. Then the response then developed to authorizing an African regional force to go in, which then became a UN peacekeeping operation. But I worked on it. It's amazing to think back, actually, that they let me do this after just a few months. But I led on that response. Worked on the council authorizing the use of military intervention, and then all the resolutions that came as a response. It was quite an amazing experience.
And can you unpack a little bit about what leading the response actually looks like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when it was in the middle of the crisis, there were, a lot of meetings particularly with the French. I worked very closely with the French because they held the lead in the council on the issue, because for historical reasons, Mali is a former French colony, and that's how it works in the Security Council, that you have a lead country, often called the pen holder. So I worked very closely with them in terms of just talking to them about how we in New York through the council were going to respond. I did a lot of reporting at that time, a lot of reporting of the conversations that I had in New York with other colleagues, a lot of analysis about what was going on and what the council could do. I remember also that I developed a very good relationship with the British ambassador in Bamako, who also did a lot of reporting, which was fantastic to get the kind of real-time reporting from him from the ground, and that really gave me, I think, quite an advantage when I was dealing with, particularly with my French counterpart, but also with other members of the Security Council, because I really felt as if I was getting real-time reports of what was going on. So yeah, there was a lot of reporting. Then, of course, because there was a council response, there was then a lot of working on and negotiating council products, particularly resolutions. So a lot of time spent working on resolutions. And of course, the way it works is that the UK has a privileged position of kind of working closely with the pen holder on these resolutions a little bit ahead of time before it goes to the full members of the council. So there's a lot of working on the text of resolutions, and then a lot of keeping the leadership in the mission informed. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, that there was a British military military element to this, so there was a lot of appetite in London for reporting of what was going on, and so that meant that the leadership needed to be kept up to speed with developments which at the height of the crisis were moving very quickly.
There is, as you were speaking, it just remembered just how much, wherever you are in that system or that information flow, the amount of information that's going from, as you say, post. And it's not just perhaps Bamako, it would be maybe Paris. So our diplomats would be discussing with their French counterparts in Paris, possibly in other Security Council member, so the non-permanent member capitals, they would be speaking as well. So all of that information's coming through both London, through to New York, to you, and then you're feeding it back. And then it's not just to the Foreign Office in London, it's to where you say is a military element, it's to the Ministry of Defence and locating the right kind of person there. How do you kind of keep on top of it all?
Well, you're right. There was a lot of reading to do in terms of the reporting coming off the network. I mean, obviously, I mentioned Bamako, but you're right. The reporting coming from the key capitals like Paris and Washington as well, and then your instructions coming from London. So you had to find time for that as well as being out and about, and obviously in a lot of meetings and also talking to your colleagues. So inevitably, it meant long hours, and so there were long hours during this crisis. I wasn't a stranger to that, having been a corporate lawyer. So
yes,
in fact, I knew how to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so that was something that I was used to professionally. But you just had to try and stay on top of everything that was coming in and make sure that you continued to provide clear reporting and advice to those who needed it.
Yeah. How did you make the distinction between having agency to make decisions about possibly what's going in the text and then having to pause negotiations and go back to seniors or go back to capital to seek further instructions? How did you make that distinction or make those decisions?
Well, I always felt in quite an advantage as a British diplomat in these negotiations, because our instructions were rarely so rigid that I had to say, right, stop, I've got to leave, I've got to go. You always had your kind of parameters of what to negotiate. You knew where your negotiating wriggle room was, for want of a better expression. And so it was never in a position where I had to say, look, this isn't working, I need to go and get new instructions. And I think that gives you quite an advantage you can be firm on what your position is, but actually if you have room to negotiate, then you can play a really important role in negotiations, because you can start helping out with language fixes, which again, the UK diplomats often have a very privileged position because all these texts are negotiated in English. You're often called upon to try and help with drafting. And so you can get very involved. You can play a really important role in these negotiations, and of course bring your own way of expressing things to those negotiations. So I felt as if I was actually quite, in terms of looking at the way my other colleagues from other countries approach negotiations. I felt like I had lots of flexibility to kind of use my own style, and also to be as helpful as possible in the room, which was a great position to be in. I really kind of thrived off that. Yeah.
I think you're right. You are given an awful lot of responsibility. It can be quite terrifying at times, almost too much responsibility at a relatively junior level.
The flip side of it is that actually, if you think about it, you could abuse it, or you could not do, or you might not do a good job with it. But that's where they back you to go in there and do a good job. And I think I would say almost always it was, I would prefer to be in that position than to be in a position where I felt I couldn't really say anything, or I had to be so rigid on something that I came across as unconstructive.
So what happened? So take me through. You're all basically sitting in, probably from vague recollections of the UN building, it's not a particularly glamorous room if you're there in person. Sometimes it's all done virtually, the haggling over the text. But so you at your level, at your kind of expert level, have agreed the text. What happens then? It goes to capital to agree, is that correct? Or do you have the authorization to agree it?
Well, just on the rooms, we would negotiate wherever we could get a room. So sometimes it was in the UN, but sometimes it was in not the most salubrious surroundings. maybe even in the cafe or something. But yes, it would be at the UN or maybe at someone's mission. And then on the process of agreeing the text, I mean, once you've got a text that is, or that the pen holder wants to put forward and thinks can garner consensus, and after all the last minute haggling and stuff, which again could be done on the phone, in the corridors, whatever, between capitals, it's then put under a silence procedure. So it goes under silence for 24 hours, and then that kind of ups the ante. If you break silence in those 24 hours, then that's quite a big deal. But if it passes silence,
incredibly annoyed. Do you know, when from the London inn, you'd be doing all this last minute stuff all weekend, and you'd get the kind of white smoke from UCMIS, UK mission, that everything was under silence, and yippee, and then someone would break it. Oh no.
Yeah. That's it can be quite deflating, that.
And what happens next? So let's pretend everyone's happy with it and they don't break silence. What happens after that?
Then the resolution goes into blue, which is I think comes from the fact that the Secretariat would print it out in blue ink, and then once it's in blue, then you have to schedule a time for the adoption of the resolution.
Okay. And have you, at this point, spoken to the ambassador and told them that this is what's happening?
So it depends on the resolution that you're working on. I mean, for the Mali ones, I was keeping him regularly updated in terms of how the negotiations were progressing. If it was something that was a bit more routine, like renewing a sanctions regime or something, then you would just send an email the night before saying there is a vote in the morning on this resolution. This is what it does. You should vote yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because they're the ones in the room putting their hands up saying yes.
Well, yes, but I have a couple of stories on that, Jen. So there was one time. Yeah, there was one time, I think it was on a sanctions regime, maybe for Côte d'Ivoire or something, where there was an adoption scheduled at 10 a.m. in the morning. And I was there for the adoption, but there was nobody else there. No ambassador, no political coordinator. And the Secretariat were looking at me saying, come on, we've got to start the meeting. Yeah. And so they started the meeting. So I took the chair and I voted on the resolution, put my hand up in the way that you see on the news.
Yeah.
So I got to vote on a resolution, which was really exciting. But then it happened again, actually. I voted on a second resolution, but this time not by accident, by design. And the leadership actually let me vote on a resolution that I'd worked on as a kind of well done for working on it.
Oh, that's nice.
Which was fantastic, actually. I don't think any other country does that, because countries are very strict on hierarchy and would only say that the ambassador or the deputy could vote. So yes, I got to do it twice, which was
what
really
was the other
thrilling.
one?
So it was the one when the ambassador didn't turn up. And then the one where they were there and they said, no, you go and do it. So that was great.
I remember, I mean, negotiations, to be honest, aren't that exciting. But being there in quite an iconic room with your little not your placard, what did you call it? The thing with your name?
The nameplate, yeah.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of choreography as well that you've got to learn that nobody really teaches you. If you want to say something, I'm thinking actually more in the EU context, but if you want to say something, you have to put your placard up vertically.
Yes, there's quite a lot.
No kind of interrupting anyone. You've got to wait politely for your turn.
Yeah, and then in the Security Council, it depends whether you're in a public open meeting, then the order that people speak in is determined beforehand. But if it's in private, then you have to kind of get your hand up and try and get on the speakers list. And then if you're in a negotiation, then it's just, however the person who's chairing it chooses to run the meeting. But normally you would just stick your hand up in that situation.
You mentioned, I think, earlier on that you enjoyed being the person, you felt it was important to be the person that stayed on top of what was going on, but you also loved being the person who knew what was going on. How important is information as currency in diplomacy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always tried to be the person that had my finger on what was going on, because I thought that was so important for my reputation and for my ability to do a good job. So yes, I think information is a really important currency in diplomacy, and because of the UK's privileged position. We were usually in the room for things which were being discussed, consultations with the Secretariat or sidebar discussions. We had an extensive diplomatic network, so I felt very well informed, and I tried to leverage that. But also on top of that, I then tried to be the person that knew what was going on in terms of, and it not necessarily huge bits of information of great import, but actually just, even as small as, when the meetings were taking place, what room, who was going to be briefing, what they were going to say. It's not kind of rocket science. It's just being on top of what's going on. And I felt that really did give me a big advantage, and a great way to build your reputation, and to, if you were the one that knew what was going on, people would come and talk to you. Because they wanted to get information out of you, and I got lots of nice lunches and coffees out of people who wanted to kind of pump me for information, but that's how diplomacy works. But that also meant that I could talk to them and find out their country's position, and also influence their country's position, because I'm saying, "Oh, this is what's happened. This is how we see it. I think, it'd be good if you supported us on this," or I was helping them to form their policy and their positions on things as well. So yeah, information gives you a lot of leverage and a lot you can do with.
I interviewed Maria Brewer not that long ago. She's a former US ambassador, and she was saying something similar. She said she'd gone on a negotiation course at the National Security Institute, and she said they were teaching a different way of negotiating, which was rather being in conflict with your interlocutors, understanding that they may be raising objections because that's the objections that their capital are going to raise, and perhaps in that situation your role is less to counter it but to understand those objections and provide them with a position that they can take back to. So you're basically helping them negotiate your position back to their capital as well.
Yeah, I think understanding the position that the diplomats from other countries have, or the position that has come from their capital, is really important. And yes, and you can, in one sense, you can help them in their role by listening to what they're saying. A lot of diplomacy is actually just giving the opportunity for countries to express their positions on things. And then I think also people talk quite a lot about saving face in diplomacy. If you can work with your counterpart to come up with something that allows them to say that they tried, they didn't quite get what their capital wanted to get, and that you yourself say, well, that's not what my capital wants, but we could probably accept that. Then if you can all come out of it having saved face, then you're much more likely to reach an agreement.
Wasn't it something that, I think it might have been Jonathan Powell, who's our national security advisor, I think at the moment in the UK, but he was part of the Good Friday agreements, and he said, I think it was him, he said, actually, a win in a negotiation is where everybody around the table feels pain. There's no one winner and there's no one loser. Everyone is bound. The trust and the relationships improve when you all have a little bit of pain in arriving at the compromise solution.
Yeah, I've heard that quote before, and I remember at the time people would say that. It's not quite as simple as saying that if everyone's equally annoyed about a text, then it's a good result. But that's kind of the idea.
To go back to your point about knowing, being well prepared, I was sort of reflecting as you were speaking. I felt I approached information, well, both as currency, but also in terms of practical things, because so much of what we do is dealing with crises and chaos. I think it was a way that I used to build resilience, to be in a better place to deal with the chaos. If I went into a meeting about a thing, if I went in knowing roughly where my interlocutor was coming from and what the crisis was all about, and maybe roughly if I'd done a bit of thinking about what the options might be, I just felt a bit more in control and a bit calmer. Does that chime with you?
Yeah, I talk about the no surprises rule, which of course is very difficult in diplomacy. As you just said, it can often be total chaos. But if you try, your aim should be to go into a meeting knowing what everyone is going to say, so that you can prepare yourself or your ambassador for that. And even if you know someone's going to say something that is going to be very difficult to deal with. At least you're not surprised when they say it, and you're prepared for it, or you've prepared your ambassador for it. And that's where information, that's where talking to your counterparts to say, well, what are you going to say in this meeting? We said that to each other all the time. What are you going to say at this meeting tomorrow? Coordinating with your allies and your friends, and then trying to, obviously it's harder to know what countries that aren't your natural allies are going to say, but not impossible. I mean, it depends how well you get on with your counterpart. But yeah, information not only is currency, but it also helps you to be well prepared.
You referenced briefing your ambassador. So the ambassador of a UN mission has got 1,001 things that they've got to stay up to speed on. And obviously they can't keep all of that in their head at any given time. So what's the most effective way? Each of you are geopolitical or thematic, deep subject matter experts, maybe not after your first week, but how do you pull out the pertinent bits to brief your ambassador? I mean, I had to do it on the trot, running down the corridor on the way to a meeting. So you have maybe 5 minutes to get across to them what they need to say, what they need to know, and what everyone else is going to say at the same time. What's your secret?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that is the best way, is to do it in person. So if it's the 5 minutes between meetings, or if it's you say to the ambassador secretary, can I go in and can I get 5 minutes, please? And you go and do it in person. Yeah. That's obviously the best way when they're busy. Well, I think you just have to learn very quickly to distill what could have been a whole day's negotiation with lots of moving parts down into just the highlights. And it's quite a skill, and I think it only comes by practice, by doing it. I think I think I certainly got better at it as my time went on. But that's the skill. But in a sense, you're not just doing it in that 5 minutes with the ambassador. You're also doing it all the time in terms of reporting, because you can't send a 10-page email to London about what's happening. You need to send a 1-page email because they won't read a 10-page one. It's the same with your diplomatic telegrams, your cables. You have to distill hours and hours of negotiations and discussions into something which is just a few paragraphs long for everyone in the network to read. But you're practicing that skill all the time, I think.
And also, the most effective cables aren't a chronology of who said what. It's a story. And I was speaking to someone else about this. It's almost like vibes reporting. It's giving a sense and a flavour without saying, and then so-and-so stood up and said this thing, and we rebutted and said that thing, and as per your lines to take, we then said this, because nobody's going to read that either. It's telling the story of the event.
Exactly, yeah. It's to give the flavour of what happened in the meeting to those who need to know the main points, the highlights, and to get a flavour, a feel for the dynamics in the room on the issue.
Yeah, and then explain the so what, like why you're taking up so-and-so's time to do it. What did you learn about negotiation from your friends and allies versus adversaries? Did anyone have really good techniques?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say about negotiating with friends and allies, with friends and allies on one side and then adversaries on the other, is that quite often it was negotiations with your friends were very hard.
And I was going to say, because there would be a lot of stropping sometimes.
Yeah, in some senses, it was harder than with your adversaries. Because with your adversaries, sometimes you just say, you just agree to disagree. It's just, you're never going to be able to kind of reach an agreement on it. But with your friends, it's much harder, because actually you normally end up hammering out some kind of compromise, and it can be very painful. And actually, I mean, I can say this now, I don't work for the Foreign Office anymore, but the dynamic between the French, the Brits and the Americans on the Security Council, of course, very, very strong allies, but actually many, many occasions where they would not be on the same page. And we, the UK, quite often found ourselves in a position where we were trying to bridge differences between the French and the US, which was fascinating diplomatically and very good for your diplomatic skills, but actually also quite uncomfortable, because, you are all friends. But the really important thing to stress is that you were friends afterwards. I mean, it didn't. The relationships were strong enough that they could withstand those disagreements, and it all worked out in the end.
I agree. There's something really idiosyncratic about the diplomatic world. You can be quite schizophrenic in and out of the negotiation. So, as you say, even with allies, with friends, you can have a proper proper disagreement and be intemperate, shall we say. But then you know, outside the room, you're back to normal and you're back to having beers and your family having a barbecue on a Saturday. It's so strange. But then you adapt to it very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You told me about one of your proudest moments was the response to the Ebola crisis.
Yes. So, yes, I ended up working on the Ebola crisis when that when there was the disease outbreak in 2014. Again, I was very pleased that the mission asked me to lead on that. It's because it was in West Africa, and so that was what I was working on. And we were obviously it was a health crisis, but the fact that it had happened in 3 countries that were recently post-conflict and still on the agenda of the Security Council made us think that we needed to do something through the Security Council. And it was at a period where we were really trying to raise the alarm globally to try and improve the international response. And the Americans were really in the lead on this under the leadership of Ambassador Samantha Power. And so they decided that we should do a resolution in the Security Council, and, you know, and that we needed to move very, very quickly on it. So my US counterpart convened a meeting on a Saturday in a cafe, fortunately not that far from where I lived, for us to work on the text of a resolution. I mean, she turned up with a draft, but we then spent, you know, a good 6 hours of a Saturday sitting in this cafe working on this draft and trying to improve it, which was, I mean, it was a great experience, and one I won't ever forget.
I always found, so I've never written a Security Council resolution, thank goodness, never been a pen holder, but had to advise and instruct on plenty. But I always found the language quite impenetrable and quite constraining in terms of articulating complex ideas or really getting to the nub and the heart of a potential solution. Did you ever think like that, or did you get used to it? Or maybe because you're a lawyer, that's the kind of language that you grew up on?
Well, it wasn't the language I was used to, because I think Security Council resolutions in particular have a language of their own.
Yeah.
But yes, it doesn't, they never read particularly, they never read or flow particularly well. I mean, that's the problem of drafting things by committee. And of course, you end up with quite tortured language when it's been heavily negotiated. But the thing about this one, and this is one thing I wanted to mention, was that we spent this 6 hours in the cafe on the Saturday drafting it, and we then convened a meeting early the following week, and no one had any comments. And that never happens. And it was an indication of the fact that this was something a bit unusual, because it was basically a disease outbreak. It wasn't anything to do with conflict or
politics.
I would say, I guess if we were trying to do something like that in today's geopolitical climate, it might well have been a lot harder. Back then in 2014, no one quite knew what to make of this text. And, you know, we were really chuffed we'd done such a good job on it that no one had any comments. So it just goes to show something a little bit creative like that really had quite an impact.
Yeah. Who decides what goes on the Security Council agenda? I mean, how does that work?
Well, in a kind of practical sense, every month the presidency proposes their program of work in terms of what meetings are going to be had. But then there are a whole series of agenda items which normally you have to kind of put what you want to discuss under one of those agenda items. And so I can't remember for the Ebola crisis, we would have had to have put it under some kind of generic peace and security in Africa agenda item to do it. But if everyone is okay with something, then it's not a problem. But people can use procedural issues to prevent meetings from happening or to oppose resolutions or texts being put forward.
You have talked about like the big picture stuff that you've worked on, but there must be some funny stories and some fun things that you remember from your time in New York.
Yeah, again in 2014, we decided to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War that year and use it as a kind of conflict prevention theme. And when we had the Security Council presidency in the August of that year, we used it as our theme. We had right at the end of that year, we did a very fun event on a serious topic, but a very fun event where we reenacted the famous Christmas football match, the football truce on the Western Front. We reenacted it on the lawn at the UN and got UN ambassadors turning up in their football kit. And Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General at the time, we invited him to come and be the referee. And he turned up in full football referee's uniform, which was just brilliant. He turned up in this, his dark coat, and I thought, he's just going to come from his office. And then off came the coat, and he was dressed all in, in the black football referee's uniform kit. It was great. And then we had this penalty shootout with various UN ambassadors taking penalties, and it was that kind of light-hearted moment really helps to break down barriers and helps you to see people in a bit of a different context, and it gives you something to talk about afterwards for ages.
I think you're right. There's so many times over the years, whether it's been me on postings or like I've done temporary duties in places, and ambassadors have got very serious jobs and they have an awful lot of responsibility, but they're also quite willing to have a bit of fun. I remember in one place I was at, there was a Christmas review. This was one of these places where you make your own entertainment around about Christmas time, and somebody decided that it'd be great fun to have like a talent show, and we got all of the various different international community, like people could just like not even audition, we were just desperate for anyone. We had like a comedian and something. And periodically, an ambassador would turn up and like properly get stuck into whatever it was they were doing, and everybody loved it because they're human after all. Yeah,
it's very important to see them. As people in the lighter moments. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's another coat-related story. I think
there is another coat-related story. Yeah. It was when I was working on the Mali crisis, and it was in the December of 2012 actually when we adopted a resolution in the Security Council to which the Malian foreign minister came, and of course it was December, it was freezing in New York. As you do, you hang up your coat in the UN cloakroom beforehand, and then at the end of the meeting, I then went to get my coat, and it wasn't there. And I thought, oh God, I don't want to go out into the freezing New York evening without a coat. But I realised that the Malian foreign minister and his delegation had by mistake taken my coat, so I had to go and use my best diplomatic skills to go and request that I took my coat back off the Malian foreign minister, which was.
And how did you do that? How did you do that? What is the mechanics of saying, "Oh, you've taken my coat"?
I think I took the direct approach of just saying, "I think I'm sorry, Your Excellency. I think you've taken my coat," and it was all fine. He gave it straight back, but. It was a slightly bizarre end to what was a very serious and important meeting.
I do think there's often moments of levity and just idiocy in amidst all of the seriousness.
And as you just said, it's a reminder that we're all human. At the end of the day, we're all people.
Yeah,
it's not that unusual to pick up the wrong coat.
So how long did you spend in New York?
Just short of 5 years.
Okay. And then you went to Geneva?
Yes. So I followed my wife again, who moved to UNHCR in Geneva. And I was, again, very fortunate. Things worked out very well for me in that there was a role that came up at the mission in Geneva, so UCMIS Geneva, working on disarmament. And this time I went from my role my title in New York was policy advisor, but this time in Geneva, I went from policy advisor to deputy permanent representative to the conference on disarmament. So I went from a not very diplomatic title to a very diplomatic title, and was working on arms control and disarmament issues.
So that was in effect deputy ambassador, right?
It was. I mean, externally looking. It was a deputy ambassador role, and the deputy permanent representative title in New York is super senior. So it was fantastic that it worked out for me, but it was a local role, very, very unusually. But again, I was fortunate that it came up quite soon after I moved to Geneva.
I've often thought and said, probably ad nauseum now, that I think the deputy ambassador role, whether it's a massive mission or a small mission, is one of the hardest because you're in charge of so much. You're in charge of the heating, you're in charge of procurement, you're in charge of recruitment, you're in charge of the car parks, you're in charge of fiscal prudence. And then when the ambassador goes, you're also in charge of negotiating on disarmament or the policy decisions and reporting back to London. How did you find the flex between those two very distinct roles?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, just to clarify for the listeners, I wasn't the deputy head of mission, so some of those admin tasks that you mentioned, I didn't need to do. But your point is well made in that, you know, some days I would be looking at a budget issue or being the desk officer writing the talking points for this meeting on whatever it was, or the person sent off to represent the UK at this presentation of this report or whatever. A very, very much a kind of desk officer type role. But then on other days, if the ambassador was unavailable, I would be representing the UK at a P5 meeting on nuclear disarmament, or making a statement in the Conference on Disarmament or one of the treaty bodies or something like that, in a very ambassadorial role. So very contrasting roles. And yeah, in some senses that was a good thing, but it did mean that you could feel quite lofty at one moment and pretty much one of the less lofty people, let's put it like that, in other moments.
I've moved from different posts and different roles, and it's very discombobulating when you're having impact or you're being treated in one way because of your role, and then you go somewhere else and, well, nobody knows you, and you have a different kind of impact and you've got a different kind of set of roles and responsibilities. How did you find that switch between New York, which if you're into the UN, that is the dream place, going from New York to Geneva?
Yeah, it was quite an adjustment because New York is everything is fast moving, it's intense. The work you're doing is, well, a lot of what I did was high profile. You know, it was in the news, it was being reported on, there was lots of interest in it. So therefore there were lots of people wanting to talk to you. To then moving to a different area of work, or albeit related, but a different area of work, which was much more slow moving, not really operational in the sense of producing mandates for UN missions and stuff like that. Much more kind of deliberative and lots of debate and discussion that unfortunately never really went very far, and in an environment that is much less intense. I mean, in Geneva things move more slowly because you don't have an equivalent of the Security Council. So it was quite an adjustment, and I have to say, I did miss the buzz of working on something that was on issues that were fast moving and high profile. And so that was quite an adjustment.
What's the biggest misconception that people have about, I suppose, the UN or the Security Council? I'm thinking specific, I mean, it's been in the news a lot recently, but I suppose it's right to ask the question, what's the point of the UN, or what's the point of the Security Council?
Yeah, it's definitely right to ask that question. And of course, the Security Council has been paralysed on a lot of issues over the years. Over recent times, you know, Syria, Gaza, North Korea, Iran, lots of really, really important issues. But the thing to remember, and this is, I think, the misconception, is that actually the vast majority of the time they are agreeing things, the Security Council. There is if you just look at the number of resolutions and presidential statements and press statements that they produce, there is that they are producing a lot of text by consensus, or at least that get through, that get adopted. And so one of the misconceptions is that it's so paralysed that it can't do anything, and that's not true. There is a lot of business, peacekeeping mandates, albeit no new ones at the moment, but peacekeeping mandates and sanctions and political offices and responses to things that have happened that go through by consensus. So I think it is unfair to say that it is totally useless and does nothing. Obviously, you know. Obviously, it has failed when it's been really needed on some of the really high profile issues, and of course that is a matter of great regret and is very serious. But on a day-to-day basis, it's not sitting there and doing nothing and disagreeing on everything. or at least it wasn't in my time. I mean, it might be different now, but I don't think it's so bad that they aren't still adopting resolutions and texts on things.
I think you've highlighted the sort of diplomat or the government's dilemma, paradox maybe is a better word. So difficult to quantify the value of the work that you do because so much of diplomacy is stopping bad things happening. And how can you measure the debate that prevented a war?
How can you prove a negative? It's very hard.
Yeah. And so 90% of what the UN does is prevent all these things and keep various initiatives and programs going, but you'll only hear about where they haven't been able to agree on a way forward.
Yeah, I agree. And it's easy to knock the UN, but there's on a day-to-day basis across the system, there's so much fantastic work happening. But it is quite difficult to kind of point to measure it and particularly to measure or to prove that something didn't happen because of what the UN has done.
Yes, you've got to trust that the principles they're sufficient in and of themselves. If you had to distill one lesson about leadership or negotiation or influence, what would it be? What have you taken away from the whole experience?
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk about one instance when I was in New York, where I used a technique to influence a negotiation that was very sensitive. In 2014, I was asked to negotiate a resolution that Rwanda, who were on the Security Council at that time, proposed to bring to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the genocide in their country. So a very sensitive topic. And of course, the UK was very supportive of this idea. But I did have instructions from London to say that the language characterising how the genocide was described had to be very precisely written in terms of who had been killed in the genocide. So not just Tutsis, but also some Hutus and those people that opposed the genocide. It was a formulation that we needed to have in. And that we would have had a trouble supporting the resolution if this language wasn't correct. So what I did was I talked to my French and US counterparts. I realized quite quickly that my French counterparts was not going to say anything because it was just too sensitive for the French, and I understood that. But the US were on the same page as us. So what I did was I spoke to the Rwandan lead on the resolution and before the negotiations and explained that we were supportive, but that we needed this precise language. And I said to him, I wanted to have this conversation privately ahead of time so that you knew it was coming and if there was any problem that we could try and sort it out, not in front of everyone else. But it was fine. They understood, so I mentioned it in the negotiations and got support from the US. And the language then was acceptable for London and we were able to support the resolution. So my lesson out of this particular story is you need to have a plan, and you need to kind of game the situation before you go in, and you need to use your relationships to work out the best way of achieving what you want to achieve. And in this situation, I thought it was best handled through having kind of pre-conversations privately before taking it to the full meeting.
I think I agree actually, and I would say I can't think of any circumstance where it's better calling someone out or disagreeing in public in front of everyone. If you want something changed, I genuinely can't think of a circumstance where you would do anything other than have a discreet conversation, leverage your network of influencers and have discreet conversations quietly. I genuinely can't think of a circumstance where it's better to just shout at someone or disagree publicly or vote against them.
Yeah, I mean, one example from my Security Council time of where you would do it completely the other way was if you were trying to agree elements to be read out to the press or something after a meeting. And you would just hold off until the end and then say, right, this is what we want, and you would kind of hope that everyone would agree with it. I mean, but I'm not really comparing like with like there.
Yeah.
But my point is that you have to have a plan beforehand to how you want to get the result that you want to get.
Yeah, it doesn't just happen by magic.
Exactly.
So be prepared. Isn't that the brownies or the scouts? Be
Scouts,
prepared.
I think, yeah.
Scouts, not the brownies. What advice would you give someone who feels unqualified? I suppose for any dream role, but maybe for a dream role in diplomacy.
Well, I would say if you don't try, you'll never know. So go for it. That said, when I'm advising or mentoring people on careers these days, which I like to do, I do always stress that it's easier to apply for another job when you're already in one. So I would perhaps advise them not to do it quite how I did it, because I left and went over to New York unemployed. But in terms of in terms of this point about unqualified, I would say go for it. I would also say you're probably not unqualified.
Yeah.
I thought I was unqualified to become a British diplomat, but actually I had a lot of transferable skills from my legal career: drafting, reporting, advocacy, negotiating, all really transferable and really useful to the role. So think about what your skills are, what professional skills and background you have, and how you can then apply them to your dream job. And I think if you think about it, you won't be totally unqualified.
I think another one I'd add to your bucket is being able to parse complex information and turn it into something that is digestible and actionable upon. I think is a big skill as well.
Yeah, and of course my training and my experience as a lawyer gave me that. It gave me a lot of the skills like that really helped me when I first started out in the role in New York.
And speaking of skills, you now run an annual course on diplomatic skills for non-diplomats. What's been the most popular part of that course in terms of your I mean, don't say me, I know it's me. Joking. I think I know. But what skill has been the most useful that your course participants have found?
Oh, well, I mean, I guess you'd have to ask them that, but I think one of the things we talked about a lot in that course, which you were part of, Jen, for which thank you very much, was actually making sense of the complex world that we live in. I think a lot of people are signing up to do courses like this at the moment because actually everyone's a diplomat. Everything that's going on in the world right now affects so many different sectors. It's not just the diplomats that have to have an understanding of all these global issues at the moment and know how to deal with them. So I would say that was kind of a recurring theme, was how to deal with these issues, how to talk about them, and how to interact with people in a way that you remain diplomatic, and you don't let these issues get in the way of whatever it is you're working on.
So actually, that's a really good final question then. What's your advice to people who are trying to make sense of the complexity and the chaos around them? Apart from obviously signing up for your course, for which I will provide information in the show notes.
Yes, apart from doing our course, which of course you must all do because it's great. But I mean, I think the first thing to say is that you just have to accept that things are very complex at the moment, and actually trying, even for those of us who work on this day to day, trying to predict what's going on or what's going to happen on a lot of these issues is just impossible at the moment because everything is so uncertain. Very fast moving governments' positions are changing very quickly on issues. Traditional alliance structures are changing. The way we do diplomacy is changing as well. So things feel very much in flux at the moment. And I think you kind of got to accept that that's just the reality of the situation at the moment. And not, in a sense, try to overly worry that you yourself can't make sense of that.
Yes. It's if everyone's in the same position, you're not the outlier. Okay, Simon, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been great.
There's so much in that conversation that applies far beyond diplomacy. First, information is currency, and it's not just the big geopolitical stuff. Sometimes it's just knowing who's aligned with whom, who can't speak publicly, who the decision maker is or isn't, who needs cover, where the sensitivities lie, or sometimes more prosaically where the meeting is, what's on the agenda, who's chairing. Second, preparation creates grip. When you've thought it through, when you've mapped the people and the pressures, who's likely to say what and when, you walk into the room calmer, more grounded, less reactive, more in control, which does sound a bit counterintuitive, right? Particularly when you're dealing with out-of-control geopolitical events. Third, trust is built in the quiet moments, private conversations, giving people a heads up, helping them save face, making it easier for them to say yes. And that's true whether you're negotiating at the UN, leading a team, or handling a difficult conversation at work. Diplomacy isn't about being smooth, although in my experience, there are plenty of smoothies around. It's safe to say I'm not one of them. It's about being prepared, thoughtful and human, and doing the work behind the scenes. And before I go, a quick note of gratitude. This week, which is in January 2026, the How to Diplomat podcast passed 200 subscribers and landed in the top 25% of all videos of all time on Spotify. For a niche, slightly nerdy 3-month-old podcast about diplomacy and negotiation and how the world actually works, that genuinely means a huge amount for me. So thank you so much for listening, sharing, commenting and indulging in the sheer diplomatic geekery of it all. It's much appreciated. Until next time, take care everybody.